Hey everybody, welcome back to BI 101. This is Dr. Duncan. Today we're going to talk about microevolution and natural selection and a few other things that can cause microevolutionary change in populations. What we're doing is we're building on the knowledge that we learned in the last class about how information about life is coded in DNA, how that information is inherited from parent to offspring, and how that recipe for life can be changed through mutations. So we're going to build on that to see how that variability, that changeability to the recipe for life leads to changes that are detectable in populations over time, and ultimately we'll get to how those changes in populations lead to the emergence of new species. Okay, well, let's get started with some terms here. All right, so microevolution technically is the change in gene frequencies within a population. So, in other words, for a population, if at one point in time you look at all the different alleles that that population has, and you looked at the percentage of individuals that have each of those alleles, and then you come back at some other time and you do the same survey and look at the same alleles and the percentage frequency in the population. If you see a shift in which genes are common and some might be less common or more rare, if you see a change like that, that is called microevolution. And the mechanisms that cause microevolution are all part of the evolutionary mechanisms that can lead to more dramatic changes over time that lead to new species. But we'll get to that, the emergence of new species, in the next class. So gene frequency, I've explained what that is, and I want you to make it clear that you understand that gene frequency is not just the proportions of genes, but as this last point points out here down below, it can also be the appearance of new genes or the disappearance of genes if they disappear from a population. Okay, now this is all about an idea that emerged in the 1800s from these two guys, Charles Darwin on the left and Alfred Russel Wallace on the right. These old white dudes with big beards had some ideas about how the world was put together in terms of nature. At the time, people already understood that something was happening in the world, that things were changing. There was a fossil record, and it showed that some species changed through time before they reached their present form in the current era. The fossil record also showed that there were organisms that no longer existed on the planet, things like that. There was also an understanding that there was change in populations or species because of artificial selection, which we'll go into a little bit more detail about in just a second. But essentially, that's when we are breeding species to get traits in them that we prefer. And then finally, there was evidence that species changed through time from the study of biogeography, which is the study of species distributions. And both Darwin and Wallace did a lot of traveling and a lot of documenting of where species are found and how they differ from species in other areas. And they're the ones that saw the patterns that revealed to them the idea that species change through time as those populations adapt to local conditions. That's the idea of natural selection. We'll define that more formally in just a few minutes, okay? So a lot of the pieces, the puzzle pieces, were on the table, but biologists at the time didn't understand how to fit them together. They couldn't come up with a way for understanding how species really change. Remember, this was before we knew what a gene was. This was before we knew what DNA was. Actually, the concept of a gene had been developed by a monk reading pea plants, a guy named Gregor Mendel, but that really didn't get out into the scientific community until long after Mendel's death. So when Darwin and Wallace were doing their work, we had no concept of like what the gene was. They had to start that from scratch. Now, I mentioned selective breeding as one of the lines of evidence available at the time for the fact that there's this thing called evolution. Selective breeding is where humans have tinkered with the appearance or the behavior of organisms by controlling their breeding. So the example here is that Native Americans used their knowledge of inheritance patterns to breed corn or maize from wild grasses. And but we've also done this with dogs and cats and cows and horses and all that kind of stuff too. To give you an example of this, this is looking at some pictures of, on the left, we see what is believed to be the wild ancestor to what we call corn, and that through the breeding of those crops and selecting for traits that were favored, corn evolved from this little tiny thing that was being harvested or grown and harvested by Native Americans through hundreds of generations of breeding, led to larger grains on the stem, and ultimately led to what you and I would recognize as a piece of corn or a cob of corn. Okay, and then so this is what we have here on the far right, which is the what we grow and feed to our domestic livestock, and we feed to each other. Okay, so that's what selective breeding was. And a lot of people were doing selective breeding in Darwin and Wallace's day. They were doing them with plants, they're doing them with animals, both for practical reasons and just as a hobby. For example, Darwin bred pigeons, for example, to come up with different traits. Okay, so this quote-unquote experimentation with selective breeding helped demonstrate that there could be changes in gene frequency from generation to generation. And again, there was only a dim understanding of what genes are and that sort of thing. But the point is that they could see changes in one generation to the next by just looking at organisms. And they were struggling at the time to understand what was the cause of that. Obviously, it was humans in the case of selective breeding, but in the wild, when species were changing from generation to generation, nobody quite understood why that would be happening and what would be going on. So the question is, would microevolutionary change like that which was seen with selective breeding, did it occur naturally? Now, I want to weave in a bit of history here by telling you a little bit about Darwin's life. Charles Darwin lived sort of in the middle years of the 1800s, and he was the very first to understand evolution by way of natural selection. Again, others understood that evolution happened, but they didn't understand the mechanism that makes sense as it does today. Darwin, as a young man, about the age of the typical college student at BSc, took a job as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. So a naturalist is sort of an early form of a biologist, someone who's got a keen sense of observation and is really good at describing things that are happening in terms of the biological world around them. HMS is His Majesty's Service, or maybe Her Majesty's Service. I don't know who was reigning at the time in England, but the name of the ship was the Beagle. And the Beagle was on a 5-year mission to explore South America's coastline and to map it. This is all part of the glorious age of the British Empire, figuring out which areas of the world to plunder and exploit. And Darwin was there to gather information about biology that might be of use to his home country. Okay, so on Darwin's voyage, as you can imagine, he was able to witness tremendous amounts of diversity, from the hot, steamy coastlines up off the Brazilian and Venezuelan shoreline, all the way down to the really cold and kind of barren landscapes of the coastline of Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of South America. But along the way, it's a gradual transition as you go through the ecosystems from the north to the south. And that transition revealed a lot about how species have adapted to their landscape. And it was seeing this that helped percolate in Darwin's brain these ideas about how species might change over time. And this is this last point. Okay, couple things here. So after Darwin completed the voyage, he got back to England in his late 20s, and he had lots of data and lots of observations to share with the world. So he published lots of what kind of like what we have scientific journal articles today. He published lots of letters about his observations. But none of them were about his ideas of evolution that had occurred to him on the trip and that he was wrestling with after the voyage. They were all about like, oh, I found this beetle here and then that beetle there, and isn't that interesting? And describing new species and things like that. He also, once he got back, he continued to experiment with artificial selection, and as it turns out, that was his way of tinkering around with species breeding and inheritance patterns for him to better understand how there could be changes from one generation to the next. Okay, so Darwin's big idea was that species change through time as they adapt to their environment. And that's a very basic biological principle now that most students of biology simply accept. It's like, well, duh. But at the time, it was revolutionary. The idea that species might change through time was counter to the teachings that most people were experienced with in Europe and the Judeo-Christian perspective, which was all based on the Bible. That was your history book right there, and your biology book, and everything else book. And religious scholars would say the Earth was very young, and they'd say that God created species in perfect form. And why should they change through time if they were created in perfect form? So this is just one little piece of why Darwin realized that he was onto a big idea that would challenge the establishment. So he actually drafted his idea as early as 1842. So let's go back a slide here. This was 1831 that he took that job on the Beagle. 5 years later, it would be 1836. And then about 6 years later, he wrote into a manuscript his ideas about evolution. And then he did nothing. He shared them with his brother, who was a good friend of his and was also interested in these things. And but he didn't dare speak about it outside of the two of them. In fact, he waited 16 years before he came out of the closet to share his idea. During those years, he was gathering more evidence to support his revolutionary idea, but he was also very shy of the debate that it would ignite. Darwin was not someone who craved the spotlight. He very much would prefer to be in his study studying beetles and things like that instead of being out and debating about biological ideas and getting yelled at by a bunch of boomers. All right, so things changed for Darwin, and when this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, wrote to him, turns out Wallace has a pretty interesting background too. He was kind of a lost soul, kind of trying to figure out what he was going to do for his career. He wasn't from a privileged background like Darwin was, and so he was trying to find a trade where he could, find his way in the world. By trade, I mean job, like a profession. And one day, Wallace was walking through the English countryside and saw this guy out in the field with a net swooping at butterflies. And Wallace was like, what the heck is he doing? And so Wallace wandered over. They struck up a conversation. Turns out the guy was a professional collector. See, back in the day, this is before the internet and TV and radio and stuff like that. One of the forms of entertainment for the wealthy in the world was to build collections. They were collectors. Some would collect antiquities, others would collect biological specimens like bird eggs or bird nests or bird feathers or entire birds that had been preserved and so forth. And that there were also folks that were beetle fanciers or butterfly fanciers and so forth. So this guy that Wallace met was a collector doing this work, and Wallace said, I could do that. What about if we team up? We could catch more species together. We could cover more ground. We could build this into a business. And they agreed to do it. and that was the start of Wallace's career as a biologist. Now, I kind of got a bit ahead of myself here. Let me circle back to fill out a little bit more about the context of the time, the history of the time, the mood of the time in terms of like understanding biology. Like I said, other naturalists were out exploring the world and reporting back their findings and stuff. Wallace was one of them. Most explanations of what people saw, they all tied to the Bible-based explanation and so forth. But Wallace wasn't, for whatever reason, sort of tied to that. He was a free thinker. He wanted to think for himself and to understand things. And that was critical because he also, like Darwin, stumbled upon the same revelation, which is that species change through time as they adapt to their environment. Okay. So let's pick up again Wallace's story. So Wallace and his buddy, they go to the Amazon for a few years. They almost die multiple times. Eventually, they wind up deciding that they got to get back to England. Wallace loses most of his collection at the time because there was a ship fire. The ship burned down. They're on a life raft. A big storm comes up. They almost die. They're rescued at the end, and Wallace makes it back to England empty-handed, with nothing to show for years of work in the Amazon. Just a few shillings or pounds or whatever they had at the time back in England, in his account from the stuff that he had shipped back to England and had sold. However, Wallace, being indefatigable, said, "All right, well, how about I go to the South Pacific? No one's explored there, and I'm sure I can build a career sending specimens back from there." So that's what he did. And the South Pacific is an island wonderland. There are islands everywhere, and each island's got a different set of species, and the species are a little bit different from the ones on the next island, and so forth. And these patterns were really exciting to Wallace, and he struggled to understand why the patterns existed and what could cause those patterns. He knew that something was going on. He didn't think it was just God being whimsical about putting a bird on this island with blue feathers and a bird on that island with green feathers, and otherwise the birds looking exactly similar. He was like, something else is going on. And that's what eventually led to his epiphany, which was the same as Darwin's, as I said. So when Wallace realized this and had his big idea, he wrote it down and mailed it to a letter to Darwin. And Darwin got the letter in 1858. It took a long time for these letters to travel the world in ships and things like that, but it eventually got there. Darwin got the letter and he's like, "Oh my goodness, this is my idea." And we don't know exactly how Darwin reacted. There's some speculation that he was not willing to share the glory of revealing this idea to the world with Wallace, but eventually what happened was Darwin and Wallace's idea was presented to the Royal Academy of Sciences at the same time. They were both equal co-authors. That being said, Darwin is the one who had a tremendous amount more thought on the idea and evidence backing the idea. Wallace just had the idea and a few observations. And what happened next was, history, as they say, in terms of Darwin published his full manuscript of ideas in 1858, a book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and that's just half the title. The real title is even longer, and that's when the E word really hit the fan. Just as with any brand new idea that advances us forward, the old guard, comfortable in the status quo, was resistant. They were like, absolutely not. This is heresy. This is basically bunk. Whereas all the younger naturalists and others were like, yeah, this totally makes sense. You guys have been ignoring all this evidence that's out there in the world that things change, and now we've got these two guys, Darwin and Wallace, that explain how and why things change. It makes perfect sense. So the debates raged and raged. And of course, eventually we know that Darwin and Wallace, their idea has been validated time and time again by observations from around the world, not just observations, but also experimentation as well. All right, so what is this big idea? Let's dig into it a bit further here. What is natural selection? I'm going to read this definition a couple of times here because there's a lot in it. Natural selection is natural processes such as predation or environmental change that result in differential contribution of offspring to the next generation between individuals that differ genetically. Whoa, that, I mean, like, yeah, there's a lot in there. It looks like a lawyer wrote this, right? So what we're talking about is natural processes, just like predation, competition, stuff like that, or any form of like environmental change. Things are getting drier or wetter, etc. Okay, and as a consequence of that, it leads to some individuals in a population having more offspring than others. Okay, so imagine, for example, things are getting dry in a region of the world due to climate change. Those plants that produce seeds that can survive in drier conditions, they're going to do better than others in the very same population, part of the same species, that don't have such seeds. And so the ones that have the seeds that can tolerate dry conditions, they're going to have differential contribution of offspring to the next generation. Okay. So far, so good, I hope. The last piece of this I need to explain is between individuals that differ genetically, and that's a key part of this. That variation within the population, in the case of the plants, those that have the dry seeds versus those that have the wet seeds, okay, that has to be linked to the genetics. That has to be linked to something inherent to the parents. I say it that way because in Darwin's day, they didn't know about the genes. Darwin talked about factors. He talked about factors that must be influencing what the offspring get from the parents, but he didn't understand the concept of the gene and certainly didn't understand DNA. Okay, so that's natural selection there for you. The cartoon kind of illustrates that. All these caterpillars are supposed to be of the same species, multiple parents. The parents that had the genes for offspring that are green are going to be more camouflaged, whereas those that have offspring that are blue are going to get picked off by the birds, and therefore they're not going to make it. Well, guess what? Who's going to survive to the next generation? It's going to be the green caterpillars, and they're going to pass on green caterpillar genes to their offspring, and so forth and so on. And it's through these changes like that, or through these influences like that, that you get change from generation to generation as species respond to a changing environment. Okay, so natural selection, there's 6 steps to understanding the mechanics of it, how it works, how it leads to changes from generation to generation. First of all, there has to be natural variation in the population. If all individuals are the same, then no individual in the population is going to have an advantage over others in terms of how many offspring they have. Okay, number 2, the variation has to be caused by traits that are heritable. These differences in the population have to be caused by something that can be passed on to the offspring. And that's what, of course, you and I understand to be DNA. Natural selection only works on traits that are coded by DNA. Number 3, the population must endure some form of stress, which causes limited survival. That happens all the time. It could be competition, it could be predation, it could be climate change of some form, whatever. Doesn't matter. As long as if the population is stressed in some way, then some individuals are going to have an advantage over others in the population. Number 4, as a result of all of this, some individuals are going to reproduce more than others. They're going to be better at surviving. They're going to be better at maybe finding food or attracting mates or building nests or what have you, or surviving in a hotter, drier environment. Who knows what? But for whatever reason, some individuals are going to survive and reproduce more than others. Consequently, those that are reproducing more pass on their genes more than those that are reproducing less. So they have a disproportionate impact on the next generation's genes. Okay, that's step 5. And then finally, the successful traits spread through the population, while unsuccessful traits are gradually eliminated. And this is what leads to these 6 steps, is what leads to there being changes from generation to generation in the populations of the world. For long-lived species, it's slower, of course. For short-lived species, you can see it on sometimes like a yearly basis. Now, natural selection acts on what we say are phenotypes, which is the physical expression of the genes. The word phenotype is in contrast to the word genotype. Genotype refers to the entire genetic material of an individual. Okay, so if I talk about phenotypes, I'm talking about the physical expression of the genes. Genotypes, I'm just talking about the genes. All right. Now, natural selection does not work on genotypes because genotypes are just the DNA. And remember, you get 2 alleles, one from each parent, for any particular gene. And if you have a different allele from your mom than the one you get from your dad, then one of those is not going to be expressed. Natural selection has nothing to say about that gene. It's only the genes that are expressed that natural selection can influence. And that's because natural selection is the interaction between the genes and the environment. And the intermediary there is, of course, the physical expression of those genes. So natural selection works on just the phenotype. Okay, the next thing I want us to do here is for me to walk you through the logic of natural selection. This is basically the argument that Darwin wrote out in his thesis, and it's been modified some time because Darwin didn't get everything right. That was the first pass at a very complex process that happens on our planet here with life. But Darwin got us started, and Darwin and Wallace. And I'm going to walk you through the steps, the logical steps of natural selection. I encourage you to not get confused with those other 6 steps that I showed you before, which were about the conditions that must be met for natural selection to occur. This is the underpinnings for why natural selection happens. So it's a different set of points here. And it's based largely on what Darwin's thinking was, but it has been modified some. Okay, over time, modified by other biologists over time. So first of all, we have an observation. Darwin made this observation. Wallace made this observation. Any biologist today can make all these observations and inferences. Okay, all this stuff is still true. So observation 1, populations have a capacity to increase exponentially in size over time. In other words, if rabbits just could keep breeding and breeding and breeding and there were no constraints at all and just breeding and breeding and breeding, rabbits would take over the earth, right? They would fill the planet, all the atmosphere, with more and more rabbits until we ran out of space on the planet. That is true for every species, plants and animals. In fact, bacteria would take over the planet before anything else. They reproduce so quickly, okay? So populations have the capacity. It doesn't mean they do, but they got the capacity to increase exponentially over time. If you need to, look up the term exponentially. We talked about that with population growth. Observation number 2. And yet, populations do not increase indefinitely. The planet's oceans and land and atmosphere is not filled with rabbits. Thank goodness, right? Populations don't increase indefinitely. We don't see that. We don't see indefinite growth with any population anywhere. We can see some fast growth for a while, but we never see indefinite growth that continues on and on and on. Okay, I'll let you read the text that's in white here that kind of supports that idea with some other observations. Okay, so this leads to the conclusion that basically something is limiting populations from increasing indefinitely. And in this case, we would conclude that resources are what's limiting those populations, that resources in the environment are limited, and individuals within a population are competing for those resources. There's a reason why we spent so much time learning about competition a few classes ago. Competition's really important on this planet in terms of biology, okay? So basically, the Earth does not have an infinite number of resources for me, for you, for any species. And if a population gets big enough, there's going to be competition between individuals in that population for those resources. That's the conclusion. Now we're going to switch over to another screen with some more observations and conclusions. Observation number 3: within a population, individuals differ extensively in traits. Now this observation actually matches one of those preconditions for natural selection, that there's got to be variation in a population, otherwise natural selection is not going to happen, okay? All this to say that just as you see variation across campus in the way people look, behave, and et cetera, there's variation out there for every species. It's just hard for us humans to see it. You know, when we look at plants or squirrels or something like that, they all look the same maybe, but there's variation out there. Observation number 4 is that those traits are heritable. They can be passed on from parents to offspring, and that offspring are going to reflect the traits that their parents have. Again, this is another of those preconditions for natural selection. It shows up here again in this logic. That now leads to our second of 3 conclusions. The second conclusion is that individuals with traits that are best suited to the environment are likely to have more offspring than less fit individuals. In other words, within any population, because there's variation, some individuals are going to be really good at living in the environment and gathering resources and converting those resources into both survival, their own survival, and then reproduction. And that differential contribution to the next generation of offspring is what we're talking about here. That the environment, that those are going to have, some individuals are going to have more offspring than others based on how well suited they are to the environment. So here's our final conclusion. This unequal ability to survive and reproduce will lead to gradual changes in the populations from generation to generation to generation, with favorable traits accumulating over time. In other words, traits that are getting outcompeted, traits that are not well suited for the environment, those get left behind because the individuals with those traits are having few offspring or they are having 0 offspring. And so consequently, those that have traits that are well suited to the environment, they're the ones that are forming more of the next generation. Okay? This process, it might sound pretty simple, but this process is what is called natural selection. Okay, that's the logic of natural selection. Now, the result of this, and this is just some eye candy for us here, the result of this is that organisms are well adapted to their environment. And we see that the world over. And I've got some great examples here of 4 species that are very camouflaged, showing how well adapted they are to staying hidden from their predators here. The leafy sea dragon up at the top right is so well camouflaged that you have to actually see it away from all the weeds, the seaweeds that it hangs out in, for you to be able to appreciate how crazy it is that a fish could actually look like that. The choice of words here is important. Organisms are well adapted to their environment. Notice that I'm not saying they are perfectly adapted to the environment, because they never are. And we'll get to this later, but essentially the deal is that the environment is always changing. So populations or organisms and their offspring are constantly behind the curve, always playing catch up to how the environment is changing. That environment, by the way, that's not just like sunlight and rain and wind and things like that. It can be predators that are in the environment. It can be competitors. It could be diseases. So all of that is considered part of an organism's environment. And when you think about all the different ways that things can be changing, you can understand why organisms are not going to be perfectly suited to their environment, perfectly adapted, but they can be and must be well adapted to their environment. Okay, so Darwin and Wallace, this is a little bit of a recap here. Darwin and Wallace has framed this idea about microevolution, that population characteristics change through time. Natural selection is the idea that they came up with for explaining what causes those changes. And we just went through the logic of natural selection. And like I said earlier, heaps and heaps of research since that time have found over and over again that this is what works to change populations over time. We see that in the lab where we breed populations like that have fast reproduction time, so we can see changes in generation to generation just over the span of hours to weeks to months and so forth. And over time, after Darwin and Wallace hatched this idea, over time, and in fact, Darwin understood this and wrote about this in his book, over time, microevolution can lead to the emergence of new species. So where a population, for example, is, and we'll talk about this in our next class, when a population becomes isolated from the rest of the population, like maybe some individuals get blown off shore and land on an island and they start a new population, they're going to adapt to the local conditions on the island. And with enough genetic change through natural selection, they can become a new species. And so we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I want you to start to see how all this pieces together. Now, public objections to microevolution, the concept of microevolution today, are relatively non-existent. People don't seem to have a problem with understanding that, bacteria are evolving to outsmart our antibiotics, or that weeds are becoming resistant to pesticides, or no, I should say herbicides, or insects are becoming resistant to pesticides, and so forth and so on. The principles that we've gone through here today are pretty obvious, and really, most folks don't have an issue with that. What does tend to get people upset more about, and by those I'm talking about religious fundamentalists that think that something like evolution could not occur, that's when you start talking about the emergence of new species, is what really chafes with their worldview. However, if they really understood what was going on, they would attack this idea of microevolution, because this is where all the action is. But that's a whole different topic for a different class, and we're not going to go there. Okay, so in Darwin's time, as I said before, a lot of biologists, naturalists, especially younger ones, more progressive ones, quickly embraced his ideas. Darwin got a lot of the credit for this because he's the one who wound up writing the book about it. And Wallace was a strong supporter of everything Darwin did in his book and thereafter. And Wallace continued to be a strong proponent for this idea of evolution via natural selection. But there were protests from what we would call strict creationists, those that interpret the Bible as the literal truth, and that things cannot conflict with that truth. And they would ask some of these questions that you see here highlighted, that if God created a perfect world, and of course they think that he did, and of course it's a he in their worldview. That's a common way for a lot of Christians to see it. But if God created a perfect world, then why would he have created species to change over time? Or that why would some species go extinct, and so forth? So these are the kinds of questions that were really difficult for people back then to face when Darwin's idea about natural selection and evolution came out. And some people still struggle with this today, and probably will for many generations to come. All right. Do you remember in the previous class when I asked you about what your own views were about evolution, and I had that question there about, do you think other species evolved naturally or were created in their present form? And then I asked you, what about humans? And you recall that people shifted on that. When you start talking about humans, that's when people get a little bit uncomfortable with this concept that humans have actually been evolving over time. Despite the fossil record, despite what our DNA says, there's folks that have issues with that. And that's why I asked that question, to sort of highlight that a lot of the objection to natural selection is because some people interpret it as sort of counter to the idea that humans have a special place in the universe, whereas other people can see all of this as being compatible with that. So, it's complex terrain. I just want to acknowledge that, and now we're going to move on. All right. One of the common criticisms you hear about evolution from folks that try to cast doubt on it is they say, well, it's a scientific theory, and not even all scientists believe in it. Well, this is a misunderstanding of our scientists' use of the word theory. We have 150 years later this thing we call the theory of evolution. But what does that word theory imply? To non-scientists, they hear hypothesis. So a lot of times you'll be watching TV and the detective will say something like, I've got a theory that the plumber did it with the candlestick on the patio or something like that, right? But what they actually mean is hypothesis. Instead, a theory is something else in science. A theory summarizes a hypothesis or group of hypotheses that are, and here's the key part, that are supported with repeated testing using the scientific method. You've started exploring that scientific method in lab this third week of labs. And so you know better now what that's all about. Scientific theories are accepted as valid explanations of how the world works. They, however, can be dethroned. Theories can be thrown out as new data arises that shows a better way of understanding how the world works, or a more accurate way of understanding how the world works. Evolution, however, evolution by natural selection, has withstood the test of time. If anything, it has grown stronger. More aspects of evolution are understood, and we are going to talk about that in a few minutes. But when we say that there's a theory of evolution, that is actually not an indication of weakness. That is an indication of scientific strength. Okay, I want to walk us through a case study of natural selection in action, and I'm going to focus on a very famous experiment done in the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, as you see here in the picture at the map at the top right. It's an archipelago, a good word for you to know. Archipelago is a cluster of islands. And you see the archipelago here in the big map. Those islands they look like they're super close together, but actually they can be separated by many miles. But they're all still in the same general part of the ocean, and as a consequence, they share a lot of the same species and the environment and that sort of thing. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, do you remember that? I'm going to go back to your slide. Do you remember that Darwin was on that 5-year voyage to map the coast of South America? Well, Darwin and everyone else on the HMS Beagle actually went out to the Galapagos Islands and spent a lot of time there mapping these islands and exploring them. And it was on the Galapagos Islands where things really started clicking for Darwin in his head. And he was like, oh, ooh, aha, my word. And all those little funny things that British people say, right? And he had all these ideas, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm understanding why I see these patterns up and down the coasts of South America. I'm seeing populations that over time have adapted to different environments along the coast. Some up near the equator, it's hot and sticky and warm, and then some down in Tierra del Fuego that are cold and difficult. And it all started clicking into place here in the Galapagos Islands. Now, I mentioned earlier that islands, I think I mentioned earlier, it might have been another class. I'm getting a little confused this semester. Islands are nature's experimental labs for new species. Populations get out onto islands, they get stuck there, they adapt to local conditions, and then voila, after thousands of generations or so, you've got a new species. And for this reason, biologists that study evolution frequently go to islands to study things. And some of the biologists that are most famous for doing this is a husband and wife team, Dr. Rosemary and Peter Grant. And I don't know that they're still at it. I haven't looked up to see. I'm sure that they've retired by now because they were doing this work back in the 70s and 80s or so. But for about 40 years or more, they would go out to the Galapagos Islands every year. And they would just do one thing. They would study the birds on these islands and measure the hell out of those birds and also measure a lot about what was going on the islands. Okay? So I'm going to present to you some of the information about this system, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to ask you to pause the video lecture and think about your answers, jot them down, and then come back and hear me talk about them and so forth. We're doing this in lieu of doing this in person, which we would normally do if we weren't under attack by COVID. So let's get started with some of these basics. First of all, birds have a toolbox. It's called their beak. This is why birds have all sorts of different crazy beak shapes and sizes. It's different ways to manipulate things in their environment, principally food. And for this group of birds that the Grant studied in the Galapagos Islands, they were studying finches. Finches primarily eat seeds, and they have these big, thick bills because they crush those seeds before they swallow them. If they were to just swallow them, they just pass right through. But you got to crush the seed in order to get at it. So many of you are familiar with pecans and walnuts and things like that, right? Well, you got to crush through the outer shell to get to the good stuff on the inside. Well, these birds don't have tools to do that for us, so they have their beaks. And if you've got, yeah, and I need to stop there, otherwise I'm going to say too much. All right, so first of all, finches use their beaks to crush seeds. Second of all, by studying generation after generation of these birds, the Grants were able to show data that bill depth is heritable. So offspring will have bill depths that are similar to what their parents have. So if you've got parents with big bills, then the offspring have big bills. If you've got parents with smaller bills, like the bird on the right, the offspring will have smaller bills, and so forth and so on. And so what the Grants would do is they would catch these birds all the time. They would measure the parent bills, they would measure the offspring bills, and then the offspring's offspring, and then the offspring's offspring's offsprings, and I think you get the idea. And eventually, in doing this for all the birds on some of these islands, they were able to see these patterns of how bill depth changed over time. And one of the things they saw was that in some years, average bill depth in the population was really small, like the bird that you see on the upper right, labeled number 2. In other years, bill depth was really big. It was more like the bird that you see with the number 1 up on the top left. So bill depth is the span from the top to the bottom of the bill. That's what the red arrows are indicating. I should have said that up front. Sorry about that. Okay, so we got that covered. So what I want you to do is to pause the video, and I want you to come up with a hypothesis about why there would be variation in bill depth from one year to the next. So go ahead and do that and jot down your answer, and then restart the video when you're ready. All right, welcome back. Let's see what the Grants found. So the Grants, I don't know what you hypothesized, but the Grants had a hypothesis that the vegetation, the food that was available for the birds, was what was causing them to have changes in bill depth from year to year. And what they did was they started gathering data on the availability of seeds on the island, and like in terms of the numbers of seeds, the mass of those seeds, etc., etc. And they also being good biologists, knew that changes in the plant vegetation was probably related to weather patterns. So they also collected data on the weather, how hot it was, how dry it was, how wet it was with rain, and so forth and so on. And here's what they found. They found that during years of abundant rainfall, so wet years, the seeds that were most abundant were very small seeds. And yet the species of plants that make small seeds during dry years, there were not many of those seeds produced. Okay? Instead, during dry years, plants that make large seeds were the ones that were making the most seeds on the island. Okay? So during wet years, you get lots of small seeds. During dry years, you get lots of large seeds. Okay? Now here's a question for you, and I want you to pause and think it through and write down some ideas. What could be causing changes in average bill size based on this new information? You've already had your hypothesis from before. Go ahead and refine your hypothesis based on these data that I've given you on this slide. Pause the video and come back when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. Let's see what we got here. All right. So here's a question for you. Check out the graph at the bottom. It's a timeline on the x-axis during the Grant study, or part of their study. And what you see on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is beak depth. Okay, beak depth here indicating like how wide the beak is. And if you're looking at depths that are up here towards the top of the graph, that would be a bird that has a really thick beak. Whereas if you look at a beak depth that's down here closer to the bottom, you'd be looking at a bird with a really skinnier beak, okay? And the line here, this dotted line that I'm trying to highlight with my cursor, and I know it appears differently for you guys in the video, but that line, that thin black line between the gray and the brown, is basically showing you from year to year what average beak depth was like on the island where the Grants were studying this. And you'll notice that there are peaks and valleys on that line. There were years like years A and E when beak depth was really thin, was really skinny relative to the previous years and the subsequent years. And then there was B, C, and D. During those time periods, there was a spike in the beak depth. Okay, so so pause this video and answer this question. What do you think could be inferred about the weather on the Galapagos Islands based on the graph that's down at the bottom? Go ahead and pause and figure out what your answer is, and then we'll come back and talk about that. Okay, welcome back. So if you were able to correctly piece together all the clues that I've given you so far, then you would have concluded, just like the Grants did, that years A and E were wet years and all other years were dry years. So based on just beak depth alone, you could make a prediction on what the weather had been like. Okay, so and this is linking changes in the environment to changes in the population. This is natural selection. This is where it's at. All right. So in the year A, or years around the year A, this was a period when there was a lot of rainfall in the Galapagos Islands, and consequently, lots of those little seeds were produced. Now, finches with really big, hefty, macho beaks would have a really difficult time picking up and then crushing those small seeds. They had like the wrong tools for that job. But the finches in the population that had the skinnier beaks, they would be thriving. They'd be like, hey, this is my jam. And they would have like lots of success in manipulating those seeds and then crushing them. And then, of course, getting energy and then therefore having lots of offspring. So what happened was that during wet periods in the Galapagos Islands, average bill depth would get small. And then during the years when it got drier, bill depth would increase, as you see here with B. And then the line would just go back and forth depending on what the overall weather pattern was like. So this nicely illustrated the connection between changes in the environment and changes in the population. We're not talking about new species here. We're just talking about changes in one trait, the beak size, and which was, of course, what connects the bird to its environment, to its food. So it's a critical part of the bird to pay attention to in this case. All right. So what I just walked you through there is what we got on this slide here. Let me see what I need to point out here. I got on the figure, you can see which years were wet and which were dry. I do want to point out, look at that top statistic. During the dry years, like the especially dry years, it was a harsh place to live out there, and only 15% of birds survived. That's pretty intense. That means that only the birds with the really big beaks are the ones that are going to survive. That's what we would call in biology, we call intense selection, intense natural selection for large beaked birds. Okay. And you would have, like, after a really dry year, you would still see the echoes of that in the population. Even though the rains would return, it would take a while for the average bill depth to settle down again to, what was the overall average over the few decades that they studied. Okay. During wet years, the reverse happened. Okay. So that was natural selection in action, demonstrated very nicely by Peter and Rosemary Grant. And that is just one study of thousands of such studies that have been done the world over with different species of creatures, that all of which validate and refine and improve on this idea that Darwin and Wallace came up with for the first time. Now let's wrap things up here about natural selection. Don't get all excited. I got way more stuff to tell you about evolution in this video lecture, but let's wrap up things here with natural selection, okay? So there are three conditions that must happen for natural selection to occur. First of all, there must be variation in a trait. And just as an aside, I'll say that all that variation ultimately comes from mutation. That's what we learned about in the previous class. Number two, the mutation has to be heritable. It has to be passed on. A mutation somewhere else in the bird, away from its gametes, it's not passed on to its offspring. Doesn't matter what that mutation is, it's not going to matter. It's got to be in the gametes. It's got to be in the sperm of the egg. Otherwise, the offspring don't get it. Okay? And then third, the mutation must give its carrier, whoever inherits it, must give its carrier an advantage in survival, growth, or reproduction, or some combination therein. That is the conditions that need to be met. Those are the conditions that need to be met for natural selection. See, that's not so hard, is it? All right. So how do scientists decide which organisms have genes that are best suited to the environment? We saw that with the grants. They were able to measure the beak depth and stuff, but more generally, how is this done? Let's take a look at, to get at that, let me ask you this challenge question. I'm going to give you three scenarios here. Which lion is the most successful according to natural selection? Pause the video, read the questions, and then let's compare notes. What do you think versus what do I think? Okay, welcome back. So we've got three things that are varying between these three lions. There's the weight, there's how long they live, and how many offspring they have. Guess which one is most successful in terms of evolution, in terms of natural selection? It's not the biggest, it's not the oldest, it's the one that has the most offspring. And the reason being that success in evolution is measured by how many genes you pass on to the next generation. And that's based on how many offspring you have. Okay, so the correct choice here would be C. This gets to a term that we use in biology all the time called fitness. Fitness is basically saying how well suited an individual is to its environment. If I had like two organisms from the same population, I could look at them. If I had all the data, I'd be able to say, okay, this one is more fit because of XYZ, whatever the parameters are. And what I mean by that is to say it is better suited for the environment than the other one. That means it's likely to have more offspring and pass on more genes to the next generation. Okay, So fitness is just another way to measure evolutionary processes. And it's, like I said, it's best measured as the number of offspring produced in a lifetime. And that's why I gave you that question about the lions in the previous slide. Okay? Fitness can also be applied to genes. We can compare different alleles for which ones are more fit. So remember alleles, different versions of the same gene, we can compare them to see like which one is more fit. So this is a concept that's flexible. We can apply it to the actual gene level, or we can apply it to the whole organism. All right. Computer froze here. Come on. There we go. All right, this might be a good point to pause, walk around, take a little break or something, because we got a few more things to get through and your head's probably full. So why don't you take a little break and then come back. Okay, welcome back. Natural selection is just one of several processes that can produce change in a population over time. There are other processes that can affect allele or gene frequency, meaning there are other processes that can lead to microevolution. And these are there's 5 of them. Natural selection is one of those 5. We're gonna take a look at each of these. Okay? So the first one is called gene flow. And that means that for populations, you got some individuals that can leave the population and other individuals that come into the population. This cartoon at the right nicely illustrates this, where you've got 2 populations of beetles, same species, but just 2 populations. In one population, most beetles are green, and the other, most are brown. And you get an immigrant from the brown population to the green population, and you have suddenly changed the frequency of genes in that population on the left. You now have not just green genes, you've got some brown genes too. Okay? So gene flow is a way that microevolutionary change can happen on a very rapid scale, because evolution can happen, almost instantaneously as when one organism moves into or leaves a population. All right, so immigration and immigration, keep those 2 straight. By the way, my little mnemonic device for this, and I think I shared this earlier, is that immigration with an I means individuals coming into with an I, into a population. Immigration with an E are individuals exiting with an E, a population. Okay, so this is one way that can get gene frequency to change, and therefore it's microevolution. Another is called non-random mating. So non-random mating is how we humans generally tend to select our mates, although I'm not going to speak for everyone and I'm not going to judge. But in general, we tend to be at least somewhat choosy about with whom we mate. Here's an example. This bird species you see depicted here is a northern cardinal, a bird that's common in our southeastern environments and neighborhoods. And up at the top, we've got a bachelorette cardinal. It's early spring. It's her first spring. She's excited to pair off with a male cardinal, and is comparing all the males in the neighborhood to see with whom she wants to hook up and build a nest and raise some babies and all that sort of bird stuff, right? So the bachelorette has 2 bachelors to choose from. On the right, there's a strapping cardinal who's very strong and fierce looking, has bright coloration, and that bright plumage says, hey, I get lots of food, otherwise I couldn't have all these fancy ass feathers. I don't have a lot of parasites, otherwise my feathers would look like crap. Baby, you want to mate with me, let's make baby cardinals. That's what the signal is he's sending with his plumage and his size and strength, and also the songs that he sings and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, our other contestant, the bachelor on the left, is kind of on the struggle bus here. Does not have a bright plumage, is clearly struggling to just get by in life, it looks like. I mean, doesn't have the color, looks weak, kind of pathetic. Which bird do you think the bachelorette will choose? Really, is there any question? She's going to choose to mate with the one on the right. And indeed she would. What we're illustrating here with my corny example here is that organisms like birds and mammals and so forth, they are choosy about with whom they mate. And that means that some traits that are heritable are going to be favored over others. Female cardinals and other birds, for example, will over time lead to males having brighter colors or other kinds of fancy things that they favor. To give you some examples of the results of non-random mating, this is a bird of paradise. I believe this is the greater bird of paradise. I should know all my names but there's 30 some odd birds of paradise. They have all these fancy feathers and do these elaborate songs and dances in the canopy of the rainforests of Papua New Guinea and adjacent regions of South Pacific. And the reason that this is all about evolution is that even though the female is responding to the colors and the dance and the songs and all that sort of thing, what's really going on is that when she chooses a male that has brighter colors, longer feathers, more fancy dance and stuff like that, she's choosing a mate that's got good health and good nutrition and good strength and happens to be attractive to the other sex, her sex. So as females choose males in the population to mate with, they wind up choosing and favoring those traits, those adaptations, those genes that cause males to have these characteristics. Okay, and the result is that over time, individuals with elaborate displays wind up getting most matings, and in species that practice sexual selection or non-random mating. So, for example, we get very elaborate displays of color that you see here. These are species of minnows from islands in the American tropics. We get elaborate behavioral displays. I encourage you to copy this YouTube link into your browser and look at this dance by the bird of paradise. We don't have time for me to run that right now. But this big black thing with the eyes and the big goofy smile is actually a bird dancing. You got to watch this video. It's insane. And the female is going around the forest choosing which male has got the best display. And over time, that leads to even wilder and wackier displays over evolutionary time. You also have elaborate dominance rituals where males will battle it out to see who gets to be the big beast on the beach. These are elephant seals, and the seal that wins will get to be the one that mates with dozens of the females that are up there on the beach right now nursing their young, and they are ready to mate with whoever wins from this competition. You also get elaborate ornamentation. I've given you a couple examples of that, but here you have a species of deer with a huge rack on its head that is useful for attracting females and having contests with other males. But in terms of feeding and things like that, it could be useful for fending off predators, yeah. But it's also like kind of cumbersome to carry that stuff around. So there are costs to this elaborate ornamentation. It's not all benefits. This is just a goofy joke. I don't know. Maybe I should probably delete this. But Darwin showing off his tats here about elaborate ornamentation. I'm not sure that back in the day that would help Darwin with mating, but I don't know that was on his mind. All right, so we've covered so far 3 things that lead to microevolution: natural selection, gene flow, and non-random mating. There's a 4th one here, and just as a heads up, we've already covered the 5th one, so the 5th one's going to be easy. Okay, so this 4th one is our last hard thing to get through for this class. The genetic drift are forms of losing genes from a population due to random effects. Okay, there's 3 types of genetic drift. It can be just the random loss of genes. There's also founder effects and bottleneck effects. Okay, so let's take them one by one. Genes can be lost from a population simply due to chance. If 2 individuals mate and have 1 offspring, then only 50% of the genes from dad pass on to the next generation, and only 50% of genes from mom pass on to the next generation. That means that half of dad's genes and half of mom's genes are now evolutionary dead end. They never make it on to the next generation. And if there's some gene that's really unique that only mom has, she's the only one in the population with it, or ditto for dad, then those genes that that the parents had but did not get passed on to the offspring, those genes wind up being lost. They're gone from the population. And that, of course, has changed the gene frequency of the population. Therefore, this qualifies as an example of microevolution. Now, this is much more likely to happen in small populations or isolated populations because one individual in a big population, there's likely to be others in the population that have those same genes. But in a small population, you might be the only one in that population that has a particular gene. And this actually is a big problem in conservation biology, where we've got endangered species that are now down to small populations. They've already lost a lot of genetic variation, and every time they lose individuals, they're losing even more. So that's why small populations are always sort of disappearing to extinction, because in part because they're losing their genetic toolbox and all their capacity for the population to adapt to environmental change. Okay. Another example of random loss of genes would be something like a tsunami coming through an island and wiping out any individuals at random with a particular trait. The key to all of these examples of genetic drift is that the ones that die off, the genes or the individuals carrying them, it doesn't have anything to do with how well suited they are to the environment. So when I talked about the parents mating and giving birth to offspring and only half their genes go on, right? The parents don't control that. The environment doesn't control that. It's just what happens, okay? Tsunami comes and wipes out half the individuals of a population on an island and sweeps them out into the ocean where they drown and die. I guess that's redundant. That's just at random. Tsunami doesn't ask questions or check your ID. They just, you're gone, okay? And so it doesn't matter how well suited those individuals were before the tsunami came. All right, so that's example A of genetic drift. There's two more to get through. The second one is called a founder effect. And a founder effect is when just a few individuals get separated from the main population and start a new population, as illustrated in this cartoon to the right. On the left, you have the mainland, and you've got a population of birds, and there's some genetic variation in the birds. Some are red and some are yellow. But a storm comes along, and a flock of birds get blown offshore, and they land on an island, and they don't know where they are. They're not going back, and they start a population. But as it turns out, they were all birds that just carried the gene for red coloration instead of yellow. And so consequently, this new population of the species out on the island has a very different genetic composition than the birds that are back on the mainland. Now keep in mind with this cartoon and these simplistic examples, we're only focused on one trait, in this case color. But there are thousands of traits that could be also different about the island population that might have to do with, for example, like the digestive tract of the birds or the hormone chemistry in the birds, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just some nice, easy visual examples here, okay? All right, so this is an example of a founder effect. Think about organisms founding or starting a new population. That'll help you link the concept to the term founder effect, okay? All right, our last form of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. So here we are not involving populations moving around in space. Instead, we're looking at populations changing size over time without changing around in space, okay? So imagine a population. I'm going to go through a animal example and then this bead cartoon example, which actually works better than you might think it does. Imagine a population of animals that are subjected to hunting, and you go from 1,000 individuals down to 50 individuals. But then regulators come in and say, dudes, you got to stop shooting these animals like they're about to disappear. No more hunting. So this hunting stops, the animals rebound. But in the new population, you only got genes that were present in those 50 individuals that survived. So you've lost a lot of the genetic diversity that was in the original population of 1,000 individuals. The population has gone from big to small and then back to big again. And that's what we call the bottleneck effect. It's illustrated here with this with these beads. So imagine that these beads are representing the beads in the jar are representing alleles for a particular gene. So we're only looking at one gene, and we're looking at 3 different versions of that allele: blue, yellow, and red. And I'm sorry if you're colorblind, but there's some red ones in there with the blue and the yellow. Now, imagine that something cuts the population down. It could be hunting, it could be a tsunami, it could be a disease, whatever. Something like kills off lots of individuals in the population. And that's what we see here surviving, is just a few individuals. Now, you'll notice that of those surviving individuals, there are no red ones, and most of them are blue. Whereas in the original population, it was about 10% were, or maybe 5% were red, and 45% were yellow, and 45% were blue. Now, because these surviving individuals over here are just blue and yellow and mostly blue, then in the next generation after they reproduce, you're going to have a population that is similarly mostly blue with just a little bit of yellow. Okay? And so even though it's the same species over just a couple generations, we see some change in gene frequency, or in this case, allele frequency over time. And this represents a change in allele frequency over time is therefore microevolution. So this represents microevolution. Sorry, I'm getting really tired here. All right. So these are our 3 forms of genetic drift. Random loss of genes, founder effects, and bottleneck effects. Okay, we are close to wrapping things up here. There are some misconceptions about evolution. Hold on a second, something's wrong. Oh yeah, so let me go all the way back here. Sorry, this is confusing to watch, I know. I've gone back a bunch of slides to these 5 different forms of agents of evolutionary change. The 5th one that we're not going to talk about right now is mutation. When there is a new mutation in a population, that changes the gene frequency, and therefore that qualifies as microevolutionary change. I did mention that briefly in the previous class. Don't know if you remember that. It doesn't matter. Now you know and understand why that would be an example of microevolution. Okay, moving forward here, I want to cover a couple of misconceptions about evolution. So among these misconceptions include evolution is just a theory. We covered that earlier. Another is evolution is just survival of the fittest. It's much more than that. It's not survival, it's reproduction. Evolution is all about how many genes you offer to the next generation, get into the next generation. It doesn't matter how big and buff you are, or how beautiful you are, or what have you. If you're not getting genes into the next generation, you are not successful in evolutionary terms. A third one, and I haven't talked about this yet, but we'll get into this a little bit. Missing links don't exist in the fossil record. This is actually a ridiculous argument at this point, because we have found so many bridge fossils between one form earlier in evolutionary history and a later form. And the other thing is that when you take a timeline and you start dividing it, you're always going to have intervals between those fossils along the timeline to say, oh, well, where's your missing link between those 2 points? And then you find it, and now you've got 2 gaps in the fossil record to fill. So it kind of becomes ridiculous to keep pushing that. And besides, now we've found so many of these missing links that it's kind of a ridiculous argument that some would have tried in the past to use. Another misconception about evolution is that it is random. It should be very clear by now that there is a component of randomness to evolution. We saw that with genetic drift, and all those forms of genetic drift that we talked about are examples of random loss of genes from a population. The other randomness with evolution is new mutations. Where the cosmic rays or X-rays strike the DNA is all up to random chance, and not because an organism thinks, it'd be really good if my offspring were more tolerant of higher temperatures now that climate change is here. That doesn't happen. So there is a component of randomness to evolution, but natural selection and and non-random mating, those are very much not random processes. Those are interactions between an organism and its environment. And sometimes that environment is its general environment, and sometimes it's a potential mate, and that would be the non-random mating component there. Okay, so evolution does have a random component, but a lot of it is not random at all. Okay, another common misconception is that evolution can't explain the existence of complex organs. This was an argument tried out for a long time by creationists called intelligent design. And it basically falls apart when you look at the evolutionary record and you look at actually how evolution works, which is largely in baby steps that modify existing traits, and they get ever more complicated over time. We could unpack that more in general if you guys want, but there's plenty you can read about online that sort of looks at the rise and fall of the intelligent design attack on evolution. This is what creationists wanted textbooks in schools to teach, that there was an intelligent designer behind evolution causing things to be the way they are. It's kind of a last-ditch effort. All right, and then finally, evolution leads to moral degeneration. It is absolutely true that in human history, the idea of evolution has been co-opted by those that would try to put themselves above others, even to the point of eugenics and genocide. That has absolutely happened, and some have flown those ideas and done those things under the flag of pursuing evolutionary perfection. Evolution does not lead to moral degeneration. People lead to moral degeneration when they take ideas and tools and technologies and stuff and oppress other people. So evolution is itself isn't something that leads to to badness. People lead to badness. Okay, enough said there. All right, we will have some videos coming up associated with this class, and the next class will sort of fill in some of these ideas. So I'm gonna just keep moving from here. I am going to cover one more though, which is, does evolution result in perfection? I did mention this earlier. There are several reasons why evolution doesn't result in perfection. This is, again, going back here, I kind of lost the thread there. This is a common, down here, evolution results in perfection. This is a common misconception about evolution. So there are several reasons why evolution can't result in perfection. First of all, evolution works with existing genes, and so those genes are modified from generation to generation to generation by the process of natural selection. You don't have the creation of new mutations when they're needed, and as a consequence, populations, they get what they get, they got what they got. And it's never perfectly suited to the environment. So descent with modification is one of those key constraints that prevents evolution from resulting in perfection. Another reason why evolution does not result in perfection is that the environment is constantly changing. Populations are always behind the curve. It got dry for a while. Populations started adapting to the drier conditions, and then it got wet, and now they're having to adapt to you get the idea. We talked about this earlier. Third reason why evolution doesn't result in perfection is that there's conflicting selective pressure. I want you to think back to that picture of some of those birds with the crazy feathers and how brightly colored they were and stuff. That's like painting a target on your back in a tropical rainforest. Predatory animals, like predatory hawks that would try to snatch those birds and eat them, it makes it difficult for those individuals with all those elaborate traits, those bright colors and fancy feathers and stuff. So those adaptations for making big, loud displays and bright colors, it's great for attracting mates, but lousy for hiding from your predators. And that illustrates conflicting pressures, conflicting natural selection pressures on a population. And with that happening, you just can't, and you can never result in perfection. Coevolution. Coevolution is when two species affect each other's evolution. Think about predators and prey, and over time evolving defenses and counter defenses and so forth that wind up they're continually like behind the curve and keeping up with their prey or keeping up with their predator, whichever one you're talking about there. So neither species is ever perfectly adapted. And then finally, you've got chance events like we talked about. All that genetic drift stuff, that stuff happens. And as a consequence, it changes the genetic frequency of a population to the point that it's not, even if it had started to come closer to perfection, something like that's going to wipe out a lot and cause it to be farther from perfection. Okay. So what is up next is we're going to look at how all of this microevolution stuff leads to the emergence of new species, the evolution of new species. And so that'll help us explain this idea of why there's such a stunning variety of life forms on the Earth. So we're going to go from microevolution to macroevolution next. All right, that's it. It's a wrap. That's the end. See you guys soon.